All right, coming up in a little bit, I'm going to talk to the folks behind a great new movie called The Brink of War about Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Reykjavik. But first, back due to popular demand, everybody's like, where's Bill Scher? What does Bill Scher think of this? Bill Scher, great to see you, buddy.
I cannot believe someone out there is actually saying, what does Bill Scher think about this? That could not have happened.
I'm getting tweets and blue skies and threads, people saying, when are you going to talk to Bill Scher? Now, we've tried to do this a couple times.
Just like you said, someone on Threads said this proves it's just made up.
Maybe it wasn't.
Who's on Threads?
Fair point. Blue sky. That's your base. We know that. Bill, this has been, you've been writing some great stuff at Washington Monthly. And you've been all over this. Really, it's the Hong. Is it pronounced Crowley? Or
yeah,
Crowley.
It's Crowley.
Okay. The Crowley race, but also just in general, this larger story about the progressives versus the Democratic establishment. So I don't know where you want to start, Bill. But what is?
Well, the stuff I've been writing about. The stuff I've been writing about lately is more about the polling factor in all of this, because, and I started writing about this last month, around the time that Graham Plattner bowed out, because one of the reasons why he stayed in for so long and maintained his support for so long, because the polling looked so good. It seemed like he had taken the hit and was resilient and had proved that people don't care about these things, or he's a particularly good person at defending himself, or whatever reason it was. People were definitely clinging to those polls, and also was a clear factor in Janet Mills dropping out because she was getting lapped in a number of polls. It clearly impacts your fundraising. People think you can't win. And she said herself, I'm out because I don't have the financial resources to compete. And so I laid out in mid-July, sort of the chronology of the polling in Maine, of which there wasn't very much of, and very little of that came from independent sources, and almost nothing from what we're old people like us are used to seeing, polls backed by mainstream media outlets. And it's not that those polls are always right. Polling is always inexact and it literally has margins of error when it's announced. But as that type of traditional polling has gotten more expensive, there's less of it. And you might have thought to yourself 20 years ago, great, all this stupid polling was just creating all this horse race news coverage, and we're not talking about the issues. And we don't really need it. But now we see what happens when you don't have that kind of polling. Other pollsters fill the vacuum, and a lot of that polling is coming from the campaigns themselves, usually transparently. Usually it's known this is an internal poll from the campaign or an affiliated PAC. But there was one poll in the Maine mix from the Maine's People Resource Center, and which was nominally an unaffiliated nonprofit, but has a sister organization. It's a 501c4 that later came out and endorsed Graham Plattner. Wasn't the only poll in the mix there, but there were Plattner internal polls as well. And so there was this period of time between the initial Reddit post coming out and the Nazi tattoo stuff coming out, and that, which was like October, and around, say, February, I think, where almost all the polling was from Plattner-tied sources that showed him doing not just well versus Mills, but doing well versus Collins. And look, there's other factors here, that Janet Mills, maybe her heart wasn't in it, maybe she wasn't doing as much fundraising or as much campaigning as she should have, that the Schumer affiliated groups weren't swooping in to like finish the job on Plattner. It's not, I can't put it all on the polling, but clearly there was a sense that Plattner was uniquely strong because of a poll-based narrative that if it didn't like manufacture support that didn't exist, it may validate what a lot of people may wanted to hear, and led to contributed to Mills dropping out, contributed to Plattner, running away with the primary, and even after some of their shoes dropped, a reluctance to give it up, a reluctance to believe that there could be more out there, that he couldn't overcome it, and it took a literal rape allegation to put an end to it. And so when I wrote that story in mid-July, Michigan hadn't happened yet, but we'd already started to see a relative flood of double-digit poll leads for El Said coming from pollsters tied to his campaign, either his campaign directly or PACs. And there was some other polling too, so it wasn't just that. But when you pull back the lens a little bit, you would see other polls that showed a much closer race that were getting dismissed because it seemed like there was preponderance of double-digit leads for El Said. And you couldn't know in the moment if these polls are on track because they line up with these other independent polls. Many of these independent polls weren't coming from great, credible sources, but they were technically independent. Or was there what's called herding, where pollsters start coming to the same conclusion, either consciously or unconsciously? I don't want to be the outlier here. Yeah. This doesn't sound. Maybe I got to tweak my turnout mix here. It's going to look so it looks like the other polls, and I won't be caught out on a limb. And then you had at the end of the campaign. So I flagged this in mid-July before the last week, saying this looks kind of funny. And then the last week of the campaign, you have this flood of independent polls as well as LCE polls showing him winning by double digits. And then at that point, I was like, this is over. This is a lock. All the betting markets went insane and all that kind of stuff. And then we learn with the results that they were totally off the mark, double digits off the mark. And people saying, well, I guess there was some non-response bias here. I guess these polls are just missing older voters, black voters, lower income voters, non-college voters. They just weren't responding to the poll as eagerly as the younger voters, the more socialist voters, the more college educated voters. And then you see something kind of similar with Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin's a different story, because Hong didn't have any internal polls. It wasn't an internal poll flex. Clearly, El Said campaign was trying to do a poll flex, flood the market with their polling, and just try to, with your body language, will it to happen. And Hong wasn't doing that. And on top of that, you just had this really weird situation where people were dropping out and coming back in. Any reasonable person wouldn't trust polls when the candidate field is barely set. I mean, there was a poll that came out that had Hong up by 20, but didn't have Crowley's name in it. And then you had the end of July stuff where Crowley's name was back in, but he was still trailing. I don't know if there even was ever one. I think there's maybe one that didn't have Barnes in it at the very, very end. But it's just obviously a very volatile situation. Polls can't keep up with that. And polls, even the best of circumstances, often can't detect late movement, close to election day, because they're in the field, too far along. So people just sort of have forgotten that polls are snapshots, momentary snapshots of public opinion. They're not really designed to be predictive. And people just got way in over their skis and assume that what you see in mid-July or late July for mid-August race is fixed. And we've now seen a couple. And I don't even know in Michigan to what extent the polls were just wrong, or maybe there was late movement towards Haley Stevens. Maybe people saw the LCA poll numbers and people were like, oh, crap, I better go vote for Stevens and stop this thing. Or maybe LCA voters said, he's got this. I don't got to show up today. Who knows?
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of reasons why, even in the best circumstances, you shouldn't trust these things. But what is, I think, different this election cycle, again, not Wisconsin, but you did see it in Maine and Michigan, this attempted poll flex by internal pollsters that people were biting really hard into and potentially influencing other pollsters, clearly influencing betting markets, which are totally stupid, and influencing media narratives, which have actual impact on the campaigns, prompting Mills to drop out, prompting McMahon to drop out, prompting Barnes to drop out. Like this is not just happening in a fantasy land, it's actually affecting what's happening on the ground.
So I asked Saliza about this yesterday, and he said he doesn't think that the poll misses in Michigan and Wisconsin would have mean that Janet Mills might have won had she stayed in. And his argument is that it's the African-American voters who are being underpolled or underrepresented in the polling.
That's not Maine, because there's barely an African-American vote there.
And that there aren't enough in Maine to have made the difference. But do you buy that theory?
I mean, there's multiple factors here. I mean, so we've heard from a number of the pollsters themselves saying we're missing voters in Maine and Wisconsin. I mean, you go back 20 years ago, the Barack Obama campaign said this explicitly. Others were saying the same thing. You're using landlines too much. You're missing young voters because you're not calling their cell phones, or you can't reach them on their cell phones because they can screen the calls. Now, as phone call polling has gotten more expensive, you're seeing a shift to using text message, text to web. Not every poll. Some polls use a mix of things, but some polls are strictly text to web. And almost nobody uses landlines at all anymore. Only a quarter of households even have landlines. And people can screen what's on their cells. I have an older mother who uses the flip phone still. So I don't think she's going to pick up. She's not even going to look at a text on her flip phone. So now you're in a situation where you're more likely to miss older voters, whereas 20 years ago you might be more likely to miss younger voters.
Well,
so that's definitely part of the mix here. But I think in Maine, I want to say one thing about Maine, though. Yeah. Mills dropped out April 30th, before there was a debate, before more shoes dropped on Plattner. I think there's a lesson here that, I mean, granted, if you can't pay your staff, it's hard to run a campaign. But let's look at this from a sports angle. Do you want to be the Knicks or the Spurs? Do you want to look at the third quarter of the game and say this game is over, or do you run through the tape? Lots of evidence here that you should run through the tape if you at all can see a slight possible path for yourself, because you don't know what might happen, what developments might occur between your nadir and the campaign and election day.
Yeah, it ain't over till it's over, and don't believe the polls. We are all, I think, too quick to believe the polls, especially when it is a wide margin, especially when there are multiple data points, not just one outlier, which raises this concerning question for me, Bill. How do we know that Donald Trump is really as unpopular as we think he is? Like, isn't it possible that those polls are wrong too?
I mean, again, we've seen polls be wrong. We've seen chunks of the electorate get missed. So I wouldn't take any poll and say this number is unquestionably right on the nose and nothing's going to change. So you can't over-interpret things. But we have lots of other data points when it comes to Trump. We have special elections and off-year elections. Ever since he got inaugurated at the state legislative level, Democrats have flipped 30 seats, state legislative seats, seated none. That kind of perfect game has not happened in at least 15 years. That's the only data I've been able to look at. You see trends one way or the other, but like the literally total shutout never happens or hasn't happened in 15 years. And there is correlation that I can see between the direction of those off-year special elections for state legislatures, a correlation between that and midterm results. When you see those numbers go in one clear direction on the off year, it does carry over into the midterms, going back 15 years. So, and this is happening, coast to coast, blue state, red state, up and down the ballot. Democrats won both governor's races in New Jersey and Virginia. Again, not the most reddish place in the world, but you're seeing other types of elections farther down ballot in red places that the Democrats have been winning. So it's not just poll data, it's ballot box data. You see it in how the campaigns are investing their resources. Republicans are worried about Texas. They are worried about Ohio. They're worried about Iowa. They're worried about Alaska. If they thought it was just a bunch of fly-by-night polls, they wouldn't be putting their money in these places. But they have to, because they're actually on their heels there. Where they feel most confident, apparently, is Michigan. We just saw a Fox News poll yesterday with LC down 4 to Mike Rogers. And it's also a little close for comfort for Democrats in Maine. Troy Jackson's up, but only by a couple of points. No one thought in January that the harder races for Democrats were going to be Maine and Michigan. I mean, all indications are it's a blue wave year. And Democrats shouldn't be worried about holding a seat. Michigan's a hold for them. They shouldn't be worried about holding a seat in a blue wave year. Yet they've really pushed the envelope into red places that no one thought they'd have a chance in. It's crazy that Tallarico's polling better than El Sayed. Crazy.
It wouldn't surprise me if Democrats win in like Texas and Nebraska and lose Michigan. But
that doesn't mean that each individual poll is unquestionably accurate. But it's definitely eyebrow raising. That you look at the set of Fox News polls, for example. Fox News has Democrats doing great pretty much everywhere in Senate races but Michigan. Maybe they're off on some level. Doesn't mean El Sayed can't win, but at least it's worth asking the question, why is it that Tallarico is polling better in this one pollster's methodology than El Sayed doing better in Texas than in Michigan?
All right. Well, Bill, people were jonesing for you, so I thought I'd give them a little taste and get to the bottom of what in the hell is going on with the polling. So thank you for doing this. Everybody else, stay tuned for some conversation about Ronald Reagan and the brink of war. Thank you, Bill.
My pleasure. Take care.
We face an enemy that is ever growing. We need to protect the American people.
President Reagan, you got us here, sir. You got the Russians to the table. Gorbachev came to play. But if we fail here, there will be war.
Of all the places on Earth you could pick for a meeting about the fate of the human race, you picked a house in Iceland?
Perfect for security.
Good to see you, Mr. President. You're early, always looking for the advantage.
I never imagined I'd see the controls for 70,000 nuclear weapons in the same room.
Here we are, the two of us, deciding whether there will be peace or war in the world.
We have tens of thousands of nuclear warheads all pointed at each other.
Why don't we just get rid of all of them? Every single nuclear weapon on Earth gone.
This is a fantasy. You have come in here with a fantasy.
I know how lonely the job feels, being responsible for millions of people.
The Russians will not listen unless we are strong.
You have a history of suspicion of us.
He is scanning all our communications.
How do you expect my people to trust you?
The United States will remain strong. We can strike you first with impunity.
We will strike as well.
The arrogance of the Americans. We are a strong people. And we have learned that strength is how you win a war.
We're not trying to win a war. We're trying to end one.
Now we are going to talk about the great new film, The Brink of War, in theaters August 14th. I think that's like today. So very soon, joined by Michael Russell Gunn, the writer, director, producer, and John Logan Pierson, who is the producer of the film. Michael and John, great to see you guys.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I have a lot of questions because I really enjoyed the film, and I'm a big Reagan fan, so I was predisposed to like this anyway. But why don't you just set it up? Tell us a little bit about what it's about and why you decided to tackle this particular part of, the 8-year presidency of Ronald Reagan.
Well, what it's about is a very, very, pivotal moment in his presidency, which was this meeting in Iceland that took place over a weekend in October in '86. And, it was a kind of impromptu thing. It came very close to not happening, but, we're all living in the ramifications of it did happen. It directly led to the end of the Cold War. And what happened in this crazy little tiny haunted house on the coast of Iceland was that Reagan and Gorbachev formed a friendship that ended the Cold War. And, coming into it, we were on the verge of Armageddon, right? Reagan had declared he wanted to build SDI, this, defense initiative. And Gorbachev was being told by the Red Army that we're going to have to invade, certainly Europe and go to war to stop this because we can't afford to build it ourselves. And so it comes at this moment of incredible tension that I think most of us, at least me, I was history undergrad, didn't know was a thing. I certainly hadn't heard of this before I learned about it. And so to answer your question about why I want to make it, when Jay and I first started talking about it, it was one of those things. He said, well, what's the theme, that you're really trying to convey to an audience? And I said that, this was a time when we were in a bipolar world, right? It wasn't like now. We didn't have the rise of China. We didn't have, kind of a multilateral situation of threats. And it was just us in the Soviet Union. And I thought that's an interesting way to tell a story about how we can work together. And, that was really the impetus of it.
I saw a reel recently where Quentin Tarantino was basically saying, I forget who he was talking about, but he was like, I wouldn't be interested in doing a movie like a biopic about this person's life. I would be interested in a day in their life.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting, we can juxtapose this with the Reagan biopic that came out 2 years ago,
Yes.
Which I personally like. Again, I'm biased toward it, but I suspect it's kind of easier to do an artistically good film that's a snapshot of a day or two of someone's life, as opposed to trying to cover from like the little boy Reagan up until Alzheimer's Ronald Reagan. That's a lot to cover.
Well, you're definitely right in my case. Like I always kind of eschewed, I get hired to write, at least on the writing side, to do a lot of true stories. And I always kind of eschew those kind of typical biopics, the kind of cradle to grave biopics, as we call them. And so it was definitely a choice that we made, that we wanted to examine this point. And the other thing is that if you choose that to focus on, it gives you a little more breadth to examine the characters. And that's certainly something that's appealing to the actors, right? Because they're not trying to think about which time period they're in and which wig they're in that day and that kind of stuff. They're just solely focused on the characters and being in that scene in that moment. And so that was something I know for Jeff and Jared, for both playing Reagan and Gorbachev, both of them, I think, felt like they could embody. They could come into it and fill it out.
And I think it allows you to make the story about more than just the person. To Michael's point, if you're going cradle to grave, it's going to be about, with a lot of credit to the ambition of the Reagan movie, it was about him. It's in the title. And yet here's a film that for the Reagan fans, you can kind of follow a certain passion there. And yet for those who maybe aren't yet Reagan fans or are less familiar with the history, in my case, I was born after these events took place.
My God.
And here's an example. Here's an example of two enemies agreeing to get in the room together and something miraculous happening out of it. And that's sort of inherently about these two leaders, but it's something much bigger than them. And so the film's able, and the story's able, we hope, we'll see starting tonight, is able to resonate at multiple levels and drive conversations as a result.
I mean, I don't want to beat up on the Reagan biopic, which I liked, but I think I think your Reagan is better than Dennis Quaid. And it's interesting because when I was watching, you start watching this movie and I'm like, that doesn't really look that much like Reagan. And then a couple minutes into it, you're like, you've totally forgotten that, and it is Reagan. And that's how I felt when I watched the Frost Nixon movie a decade or so ago, where the actor just became Richard Nixon within 5 minutes. And to me, that's like really good acting. But talk, if you would, about that and about the casting of this, because you all landed, you guys landed some really high caliber actors. And this is a little bit fraught with danger. Playing Ronald Reagan is a tough gig, probably assignment to get.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, one of the things
because you don't want to do it in person, like, well, there they go again. That's the danger, is that you end up becoming like a caricature of this.
Absolutely.
person.
You're 100% right. And we talked about a lot of that with casting and in the prep process, So what I said to Jeff Daniels, who plays him, what I said to him was that we wanted to suggest Reagan. And we really latched onto that because, he's so well known for comedy. I embarrassed myself on a panel the other day when I said I grew up with the Jeff that was arachnophobia, that was Dumb and Dumber. So
I told my son, I'm like, this is the guy from Dumb and Dumber.
Yeah, I know.
Like, that's a lot of range.
It's a crazy range, right? I mean, it's like I said, like, I don't know how this guy doesn't have 2 Oscars already. Like, he can do Dumb and Dumber, and then he can do, The Newsroom, and he played a Republican on that. I think a lot of people forget he was playing a Republican on that show. And that was the first thing that I noticed, was that that was my first show. And to watch him go from that world, from arachnophobia and Dumb and Dumber, to that world, to the kind of Sorkin dialogue world where he's doing 12 pages of dialogue a day, the guy can do anything. The question is, does he want to do it, right? Because it's such a challenge, like you mentioned. And I think that one of the things that he said early on was that he was pretty sure he was going to fail. And that's scary. And as an actor, he wants to be out there and find something that's a challenge and that's going to scare him. And so, we talked a lot about this, that, if we go too far with this, it's going to be an SNL skit. We don't want that. We want it to be authentic. We want to draw you in. And he used this metaphor, when I said the suggest thing, he used this metaphor of, he wants to bring the audience in. Exactly what you experienced. He wants to draw them in, and not put a bunch of makeup and prosthetics on that pushes them away and they start to look, oh, that looks a little fake. And so he really wanted to draw them in, and really, the thing we talked about a lot is there was a civility, there was a cheerfulness, there was humor, and there was dignity and moral clarity to Reagan. And that's the things that I think Jeff Daniels embodies. He's played all these American figures over time, and famously Chamberlain, right, in Gettysburg. And so I think he embodies this kind of old school American sense of civility and moral clarity that Reagan had. And I'm really proud of his performance. I think it's, he really crushed it.
And I think there was a lot of fear around that heading into the film that all washed away. There was this beautiful moment. I'm going to embarrass Michael a little bit because it is a direct line from the prep that he and Jeff did before Iceland to the first day on set. But we do camera test days. And typically these are very technical, boring days. It's a couple days before we start shooting. And it's literally just making sure, does the camera work? And, they'll bring out the mouse and, does this do something weird in the camera? Okay, no, now bring the blinds out and see if they do. But it's also a hair and makeup test. And again, normally the actors come on, they do a couple spins, they sort of ham it up for the camera, and then they leave. And we're in the Hoffey house. We shot in the real house where the summit took place, in the real room that the summit took place in. And Jeff walks in it was the first time most of us had seen him in the wardrobe, in the makeup, with the hair. And he walks into the room, and you didn't even have to know he was walking in, because this sort of silence swept over the house. And all of a sudden, the room that was loud from all the grips that were yelling and laughing and drinking coffee next went quiet. And then the technical area where all the people with the monitors and the fancy equipment went quiet. And then you saw him sort of come in at the front of that wave, and the house goes silent because in had walked President Reagan. He had the gravitas, he had the posture, he had the energy, and there didn't need to be a single AD telling anyone quiet on set because the weight and the importance of the story had sort of washed into the building with him. And I think that's the moment at which Michael and I were standing next to each other and sort of like two little boys hoping to be filmmakers one day, sort of elbow each other because you were like, oh, there's something here, and he's got this. And it not to diminish the incredible work that followed, but it sort of it went from there.
Now, for those of us who are Reagan fans and familiar with the sort of mythology about this Reykjavik meeting, there were a couple things that you seem to maybe downplay a little bit or not.
Mhm.
And I think if you had overdone these, it might have come across as cliched. But let me just give you two examples, and I'd love to get your feedback as to whether this was intentional or whether maybe I just missed it.
Mhm.
One common thing that you'll hear conservatives talk about is how Reagan shows up to meet Gorbachev, and Reagan's wearing just his sports coat, and Gorbachev is like bundled up in a coat. And apparently the story is that there's a KGB agent who says like, well, we've already lost we've lost the negotiation before it began because Reagan looks, it's super cold out there in Iceland. Reagan looks fit and younger. And he sort of, Reagan puts his hand on Gorbachev's back and helps him in the door. So the optics, and I think it might have been referenced, but it was, you downplayed it. The other part is that the story of the Reykjavik meeting is that it was Reagan who walks away because he's not willing to give up on Star Wars, and Reagan walks away from it. And that's a little bit different than the portrayal of the movie, where it seems like it's actually more Gorbachev who walks away from the table. So tell me, is my history wrong? Did you intentionally want to avoid the cliche? What's the story there?
Oh man, Matt, I'm loving this because now we're getting into my history nerd mind, and so I love this. So the first thing is you're absolutely right about the overcoat on Gorbachev and Reagan showing up in a lighter coat. The historical piece of it is that happened at Geneva. So they had a meeting before in Geneva in '85, and that exact thing you're saying.
So I'm conflating two different things. Okay.
And so in Geneva, that happened, and Reagan kind of famously put his hand on his back, and you'll notice now we have all these foreign leaders. This is me geeking out for a second. You have all these foreign leaders who are super wary of an American president doing this. I don't know, they always are kind of like moving out of the way, so they don't want to have an American pat them on the back or whatever. But this is a really famous move of Reagan's, and it totally worked. And the Soviets lost the game right there in terms of world optics. The way I tried to draw in for those like you and I who are, super fans of history was we have Raisa reference that. She's like, when she in that first scene with Raisa and Gorbachev, she says, don't take the heavy coat. You'll look like, like you can, and so he specifically does it, and he didn't. He wore a lighter coat into Reykjavik. And for the second piece of it, the question about like Reagan walking and Gorbachev. So what we portray in the film is something that really happened that was to me was, and I think certainly to Schultz was a really powerful moment, which is when they couldn't find the common ground on SDI, on Star Wars, Gorbachev got up and said, I'm afraid I will never see you again. And on the American side, that was they were there to decide if there was going to be peace or war. That was it. It was a famous statement that Reagan made, like, we're the only two people in the room. We're going to decide if there's peace or war in the world. And so when Gorbachev gets up and says, I'm afraid I'm not going to see you again, the Americans interpreted that as, oh my gosh, this is it. It's going to be there's going to be a war. And Schultz is trying to figure out, unfortunately we had to cut this scene for time. It's devastating to me. We had to cut this for time, but there's a scene where Schultz was sitting in the scrambler to call Washington.
George Schultz, who was Reagan's top advisor. And
yeah, his Secretary of State, and he was like lamenting, how do I call H.W. Bush, the vice president? How do I call the chairmen of the Joint Chiefs and say, we're coming back to have a cabinet meeting right now because we don't know if there's going to be a war. This was a huge moment. But and so Reagan, you're right, Reagan walks out, but it's really Gorbachev who understands immediately that there was a breakthrough between the two men. And so it was really, a fascinating twist. Most of the film takes place from the American perspective. But right at the end, we switch a little bit into the Soviet perspective, where it was actually Gorbachev goes out and gives an immediate press conference. The Americans walk away, we get on a plane, we come home. Gorbachev goes out and gives a press conference. It's like, it was great. We had a great time. We had a great breakthrough. Everything went great. He immediately understood that he formed a relationship with Reagan. And it wasn't until a couple of days later in Washington when Reagan and Schultz started giving speeches saying they realized, oh, we did have a breakthrough. And so, if I can nerd out one quick more second on casting, how much it matters. Jared Harris is British. Jared Harris plays Gorbachev. And he brought this British perspective to it. And he stepped on set and he said, Michael, I read all the transcripts. I read all the books. You Americans are always talking in sports terms. The ball's on the 1 yard line, swing away. You're always talking in sports terms. You guys showed up and thought it was a ball game. The Soviets weren't there to win a game. They were there to figure out a relationship and work on the future. And so the Americans walked out. We walked out because I grew up in this culture, right? I went to Clemson and go Tigers. And, that was the world I grew up in. So I didn't even notice that. In years and years of research and writing, I didn't notice how the Americans were treating it. And so it was really, this thing was when we were trying to convey what the future was, what Reykjavik really meant. We were trying to say, how did this relationship form in Reykjavik? And then what did the future lead to? And so that's why we have this kind of twist to the ending, how we have kind of shifted into this space where Schultz starts to give a monologue and things like that.
I really like the movie. I think one of the criticisms of the movie is that it could be a play. I think that is actually a good thing. A Few Good Men is one of my all-time favorite movies, and it's a play. 12 Angry Men, if you want special effects, this movie's probably not for you. If you want dialogue, interesting dialogue that frankly has to really work without the bells and whistles and tricks, then this is a ticket you need to purchase. But talk, if you would, about maybe the difficulties of making a movie where the dialogue has to kind of stand without any, without much fancy. I mean, there's like 3 settings. There's like Reagan's, room. There is Gorbachev's. He's on a ship, I guess. Yeah. And then there's the conference room, basically, where 90% of the action takes place.
Well, Michael, can I jump in for a quick second? Because I can brag about it in a way that you can't, or at least shouldn't. For your audience who hasn't yet had a chance to see the film, I would add to that it's the dialogue, but it's the tour de force performances from these 3 legendary actors, and I think that's we'll take the 12 Angry Men reference all day long, and would proudly say, if you like 12 Angry Men, come see our film. But I do think that it's the combination of the dialogue and these just powerhouse performances of 3 actors, 2 in particular, but the trio of them who, to use our American sports references, came to play. And I think that's one of the coolest things about the film. But anyway, yeah. Michael, I just had to brag a little bit there.
I haven't mentioned J.K. Simmons, who plays George Schultz, but he is a fantastic actor, and everyone out there has seen him in Whiplash or some, car commercial or something or it's like an insurance commercial you see during the NFL game. Superb actor. You mentioned Raisa Gorbachev, and she really comes across as an interesting figure here. Like, she seems very, I don't want to say Machiavellian because that suggests evil maybe, but very savvy and very much attempting to kind of win this subplot against Nancy Reagan. It seems like Raisa is very cosmopolitan. She's probably a very good advisor to her husband, maybe even very important to, one would imagine, to his rise and his success. And yet it seems like she is not well known in the Soviet Union, and that she maybe feels a little bit like she has not gotten the attention or that she probably deserves. But how much of that is like a comic, maybe comic relief subplot versus like actual documented history?
Ooh, great question. I mean, it's absolutely true. She did this real thing. She, you know, they deliberately sandbagged Nancy Reagan. I mean, they told her that, the wives were not coming and to Reykjavik. And so that absolutely happened. And, you're right that we use it in the film for a little bit of comic relief and to kind of play this kind of cat and mouse game between the two of them, across the Atlantic. But she was very savvy, very savvy. She was certainly the first lady of the Soviet Union who understood how the Western press worked and was extremely savvy about how to use that to her advantage. And, one of the reasons that, obviously it's an amazing relationship that exists between both men and their wives. It's not always the case that our political leaders trust their wives and, use them as advisors and have a real love for them. But I think both these men did. They really genuinely loved their wives and they trusted them and trusted their opinions. And the other reason I wanted to include it in the film was because, we ask so much of these women. The first lady it's not a paid position, yet we expect her to represent America, and get out there on the world stage and do things. And it's also their office isn't paid for, or at least historically hasn't been paid for by the American taxpayer. It's not like the office of the president where, we pay for his suit so he looks good on television or whatever it is. This is a situation where they have to go out and raise private donations to run their office. And so we ask so much of them. And I thought it was a way to include the necessary and stakes of these two women who are representing their countries, literally their countries, when the press is completely locked out of the conference. And so they only have this opportunity to follow the first ladies, and they do. And Raisa really did this. She went around Iceland on tour. And so it's a wild kind of thing.
And it really works because you got to have something to switch to.
Yeah.
So it is sort of a comic relief, but also part of the story. So that was a very good device. Works very well. Let me ask you guys about Ronald Reagan's, during the negotiation, he talks about human rights. And on one hand, you could see this as a strategy, like a way to, to sort of force Gorbachev. We really want him to negotiate getting rid of nuclear weapons or but so we're going to ask for human rights and settle for fewer nuclear weapons. But one really gets the sense that, and I believe that Reagan cared, that Reagan had this moral clarity. Actually, he really believed it. I also think Reagan understood that invoking moral clarity was just a great weapon against the Soviets, not just in terms of this one negotiation, but in terms of just showing this evil empire and that this is a great moral battle, and we are on the side of the angels. So, but Reagan talks about these. I think they're called refuseniks. These are Jewish people in the Soviet Union who want to leave, and they're not being allowed to leave. And Reagan, so I have to say though, and Reagan said at least twice in this movie, well, we are a nation of immigrants.
Yeah,
and I have to tell you, in the context of the world we are living in today and the America we are living in today, that hit me on multiple levels. Is that something you were going for?
Yeah.
Or is that just me?
Well, no, I mean, I'm glad it struck you. I mean, it's one of those things that I wish, Matt, I wish I could tell you I timed this movie. It takes so long to make a movie. I wish I could say I timed it and it was the most, relevant thing, not just the immigration debate that you're talking about, but also for now, all these treaties that these guys built are now expiring. So we have, China building up their arms and, for the first time since these events in 86. And so I wish I could tell you I timed it. I didn't. It took me 10 years to get the movie made. We shot it almost 2 years ago in Iceland. And so I wish I could say I timed it. I didn't. But I can tell you for sure that not only did he absolutely say those lines, that he believed that, and he said those lines. They're in the transcripts. You can go to the National Security Archives and find the transcripts. But he believed and believed that. But I think that, those things, it's one of those lessons to me as a filmmaker that those things, the world is changing so fast that those things land in a completely different way. When I wrote those lines and we shot those lines, nobody batted an eye. And now when we go in a theater and that happens, the whole room goes quiet. You know what I mean? Like, this is a Republican president saying this line. And so, the thing that I think is really the thing that Reagan brought to that table, like you mentioned, using that kind of almost as a weapon. And I think what he deeply believed was in the American purpose, that America could be a force for good in the world. And that he really believed that if he showed Gorbachev that if Gorbachev wasn't willing to use violence to oppress people, that then there was not a hope that the Soviet Union could survive, because that was the only tool they had. They only had violence for oppression. And I have to tell you that we had numerous members of our crew who grew up behind the wall in Eastern Europe. And I'll tell you the quick story of one. I think we in the West kind of view Gorbachev as a bit of a saintly figure. We view Gorbachev as somebody who ended the Cold War peacefully. He allowed the Soviet Union to dissolve peacefully. And this is the first time in human history that an empire has ever dissolved peacefully, right? But we had this Polish cinematographer. She grew up behind the wall. And she grew up behind the wall. And she was an amazing cinematographer. Her name is Magdalena Gorka. And we're standing around on set one day and we're talking with Jared Harris, who plays Gorbachev. And we're talking about, we all admire Gorbachev. Yeah, I think rightfully so. But she said, hang on a second. Like, this same guy was in power for a long time with the KGB on speed dial and still sending people to the gulag. So yes, he found a partner in Reagan and he ended the thing, but don't say he's a saint, right? Don't tell me that he wasn't a part of a system that kept me and my family in chains, essentially. So I think it was good for all of us, in the West to hear that kind of perspective, because I think, Reagan was right. Reagan was right that if violence was the only way for the Soviet Union to exist and keeping and oppressing people, that wasn't a long-term possibility in the world.
I think that's a great place to end it. Obviously go see the movie, The Brink of War, out now when you're seeing this. But anything I missed? Any final thoughts?
Matt, I just want to say to your audience that I want you guys to go out and see it in the cinema the way we meant it to be. It's going to be on 2,000 screens across this country, which is huge for this tiny little indie movie. And that what you're going to see and what I hope you walk away out of the theater with is hope. If we can work together, we can make a better world just like these two men did.
Michael and John, thanks, guys. Go see
Thank you so much, Matt.